Good morning and welcome to Rose Red Homestead, where today we are going to do an RRH class, Rose Red Homestead class. And many of you already know the format of these classes is a little bit different than our regular videos. They're longer, up to maybe an hour, and they're more in the format of what you might get if you were sitting in one of my university classrooms before I was retired. So, one of the most important things you'll need to do before we get started is to go to our website and download this handout. It is a 3-page handout and it contains the important information that you'll need to have in front of you as you follow along with our discussions. Now, because we always get question after question after question on where do I go to get the handout, where do I go? We're actually going to demonstrate that. We're going to go into my computer and do it. First of all, you go to our website, and here it is right here. But you can also just type in Rose Red Homestead, all one word, .com, and that will also take you there. So I want to show you where exactly to go to get it and how you get it. So we're going to go into and sit at my desk for a minute and do that online. Right up here in this menu bar, you can type roseredhomestead.com. And hit enter or return, and here you have our website. This is our home page on the website. We have 4 pages. We have home, recipes, books, Amazon store. You want to stay right here on this home page, the one that you land on once you type in the URL. Then just scroll to the very bottom of this page. You'll see a section on downloads. Keep going. Right here are the RRH class handouts, and the one for today is Safely Adjusting Tested Recipes. So you come over here and click download, and then wherever you go to get your downloads, which is right here for me, and then a little sign will come up and say that it's there. Then click on that, and here it is. And then you just print it out, or however you manage it, but it needs to be in front of you while we do this class. So that's all there is to it. It's very, very easy. All right, let's go back to the kitchen. All right, so just pause the video for a minute, make sure you have that handout in front of you, and here we go. So today we're going to be talking about safely adjusting tested recipes. And this is our 5th class. We're really excited about these classes. They've been so well received. And if you have ideas for classes that you would like, just leave a comment under this video and we'll see what we can do about it. We get requests all the time in comments that say something like, Pam, I want to do this recipe. Is this recipe okay? And can you please use your logger to test this food or that food? Even though the USDA says you can't do it, would you please use your data logger, your gadget, as it's come to be known on our site, to test that food to see if it really is okay? Well, I want to explain to you today what a tested recipe is, because I won't do any of those things, and here is the reason why. Almost all of us do our own cooking. We're very familiar with recipes. We know how food fits together, and we do a lot of things in our own kitchen. And when we hear the term tested recipes, we may think that, well, what is there to a tested recipe? I can do as good as anybody else can in terms of making sure something is safe for canning. Well, let me explain to you exactly what happens in a food science lab when they test recipes. First of all, it takes PhD level food scientists and chemists to really understand all of the processes involved when you put ingredients together. How do they interact with each other? What are the results? How much does this much liquid affect the density or the volume? And so things are very carefully measured and carefully tested. And it takes advanced graduate level knowledge in order to know to do that. Now, yes, I'm a PhD, but I am not a PhD in food science. My kitchen is not equipped to do any kind of food testing. A couple of years ago, I used my gadget to test 3 electric canners. They were just coming out, and the claims were that they were safe to use for canning. And I tested the Presto Digital, the Instant Pot Max, and the Nesco or the Carry, which is the same thing. And all were found by my data, and I repeated that science just exactly the way. There was a study done by Utah State University, and they gave their protocol for how they did the testing. I bought the same equipment and followed the same testing protocol to do that, and found that for our elevation, and that's the only claim I can make, which is at 5,000 feet, those 3 canners did a pretty good job. There was one little thing about the Presto Digital that couldn't handle quarts of the viscous spaghetti sauce, but everything else was just fine. Now, they no longer make the Instant Pot Max, so I don't refer to it anymore. And I've given my Presto away. It was too fussy for me. I just didn't care for it at all. But I did stick with a Nesco, and that's kind of my go-to electric canner when I need an electric canner or to do small batches. But in terms of food, will you just tell me if this recipe is safe? I can't tell you if the recipe is safe, because of the extensive amount of testing that goes into creating what is known as a tested recipe. There are 3 categories of labs in the country that do food testing. One of them is the USDA, and they don't do much testing anymore on foods. They pretty much stick with the testing that they have done over the years because funding has been cut and they have lost a lot of their important people. But we do have their complete guide to home canning, and they update this once in a while to make sure that it is current. And so this is a great place to go for tested recipes. And we are right here. We're going to learn today and then apply, and then we're going to check our learning, and then we're going to review. So we're right here in part 1, which is learning. And you can see on your own handout that I'm now down in the section of where to go to get tested recipes. So that USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning is one. Now, they are pretty vanilla in their approach to the foods that can be canned. And we all know that we sometimes like things a little bit fancier, with a little bit more flavor, or we would like to deviate just a little bit. And the Ball Blue Books, and I have 3, well, I have 2, are really resourceful in using their food laboratories to test recipes that have a little bit more flair to them. That's why I really like the Ball. Well, as you can see, I have this bookmarked in a whole lot of places because these recipes have just a little bit more pizzazz to them, and they are tested recipes, so these are safe. So I have 2 Ball books that I use, this one and then this one. And you probably, if you have these books, know that there's a lot of overlap. Some of the same recipes are in both, and that's just fine. And then out of Canada, we have Bernardin. And Bernardin is a sister company to Ball, and they also do a little bit more pizzazz than just the USDA. So I really like Ball and Bernardin. And then the third source for recipes are our state university extension offices. And land-grant universities in just about every state have the extension office. In Utah, it is Utah State University. When I was a professor at University of Nevada, Reno, that was the university, that was a land-grant university that had the extension office. University of Georgia, their cooperative extension, has published this book, and it is quite extensive. I waited several months before I could get a hold of one of these because they were out of print for a while. They were redoing them, which is always a good idea. Now, while I don't particularly care for the format of what is here, it is very extensive, and there are no pictures. I think pictures sometimes help educate us in terms of how things should look, but nevertheless, there's wonderful information here. And in terms of the rest of the extension offices, I don't know if anyone else publishes a book like similar to this, but I know Utah doesn't, but they do have recipes. The extension offices have recipes on their websites that are tested and are safe. So that also is a good source. Then an internet source that I really trust is healthycanning.com, and the link is there on your handout for you to be able to check that out. And the reason that I really like them is that they publish recipes, but they pull in information from so easy to preserve, like this one, from the USDA books, from a lot of other sources, and put it right there with the recipes so that you can read through and see what these food scientists have said about doing things in a particular way. And they are one of my major trusted sources, and that's healthycanning.com. Now, we also have a video out there that is on finding tested recipes online, and you can click on that link and see that video when you have time. So we are at the part in the handout now that is called Guided Notes. And this is a strategy that I use in my university classes where I write down like topics or questions with the expectation that my students will fill in the notes pertaining to that idea, because these are the big ideas of what we're going to be talking about. So I've left space for you to write as we go, and so just jot down some notes. So I have just finished showing you these books, this collection of books that has good, safe, tested recipes in it. Now the publication dates of all of these books are within the past 10 years. And that is what the recommendation lifespan is of books that have tested recipes. They're good for 10 years, and after 10 years, please don't think that they're safe. By then, conscientious folks at Ball and the USDA and the University of Georgia will have put out new editions of the books that have all of the updated information in them. You know, science, especially food science, is not a static content area. Things change all the time. As our technology advances, we have more capability of doing things, then anything related to science is going to change. So it is not like a law that is there forever. Now some are, but in terms of tested recipes, they will update things, and we're going to see a little bit about that today. So I have another Ball Blue book, and this is it. And I've had this for a lot of years. Pub date on this is 1999. That's the last time that it was updated. So it's way, way out of the safety range. And those of us who are closer to my age might have a whole collection of older Ball books. Some people collect the older Ball books. I have a couple of sisters who still use recipes out of those old Ball books in spite of my telling them that, ooh, be careful, be careful. And so what about that? Are all tested recipes safe to use if they come from these books? Well, yes, if they are within 10 years, but maybe not so much if they are older than 10 years. And so we're going to learn some strategies today about what we might be able to do with these older recipes to just double check, make sure that if we have a recipe that we just love from these older books, are we going to have to give it up? Or can we tweak it around a little bit to make it safe? So that's what the important thing is here, is making sure that it is, whatever we do is either a tested recipe or that we have brought it up to standards for today's canning science that we know about. Now that we know the intricate and detailed testing that must go on for a tested recipe, we need to brace ourselves for the possibility that some of our favorite recipes that we just love are no longer safe. So please prepare yourself for that. We can make some changes. There are some guidelines for some changes, but there just are some things that we should abandon and either just fix and eat fresh or abandon them altogether because they can no longer be safely canned. And you know, as things advance, old things are no longer pertinent, and in canning, they're no longer safe. And so we just need to be sure that we can let go of some things if necessary. So the things that we can change, they're not broad we've got to remember that those tested recipes have a pH that is balanced, have liquid that is balanced, have ingredients that work well with each other. And so we're messing with that just a little bit. And the experts in canning have said that there are some things that we can adjust, but a lot of things need to remain intact. And so we're going to go through a set right now, and that is in number 2 on your guided notes. There's a whole list there of things, and go ahead and make notes so that you can remember what the changes are that can be made. The first category is herbs and spices. Well, that's good news for us, because that's where a lot of the flavor comes from, the recipes that we just love so much. And I get asked all the time, can I leave this out? Can I put some of this in? And now you'll be able to answer that for yourself, because here are the parameters for changing out or substituting or dropping whatever herbs and spices. And what the experts say from Utah State University and others across the country, as well as healthycanning.com, is that whatever you change out in a recipe in terms of seasonings, and this is, I put out here just some samples, they have to be dry. They cannot be fresh. You cannot, for instance, exchange fresh basil for dried basil. The reason for that is that whenever we use fresh things for flavors and seasonings, it contains moisture, and they are low acid. All these herbs and seasonings that we have here, they're all low acid. And so if we put the fresh form in, what is happening is that is going to change the pH of the mixture. So our tweaking with herbs and spices can only be done with dried versions of the herbs or the spices. And so I have here just a collection, and you can apply this to anything of the dried seasonings. This is basil and thyme and oregano, and then we have Italian seasoning. So if something called for 2 teaspoons of Italian seasoning and you didn't have any, you could put your own mix together. Now, does it have to be the same volume? Not necessarily. One of the scientists up at Utah State University says that you can add from a half to a full teaspoon of additional herbs if you wish. You can leave them out, you can put them in. And so we have a lot of leeway here. Now, this group is cinnamon, nutmeg, and ginger. And this sort of makes me think of pumpkin pie. So you could use pumpkin pie spice in place of these if you wish. Cloves should be here too, of course. And then this is just a mixture of things. We've got bay leaves. Oh, does that mean I could put a bay leaf in or take a bay leaf out of a recipe? You bet. This is dried garlic because it is not fresh. Yes, this is a seasoning and we could put it in, or it's an herb, whatever you'd like to call it. This one is celery salt. I love celery salt, especially in potato salad, but of course we don't can potato salad. But in any case, these cumin and coriander, anything that is dried, can be alternated in a recipe. So that gives us some latitude, and that's really cool. One of the things that it is good to remember, one of the experts, and I cannot remember which extension office she came from, suggested that if we are going to adjust the herbs and spices in a recipe, it's best to do a small batch first to see if the flavors are going to be okay. Sage is not recommended. You won't find it in very many tested recipes at all because it turns bitter with pressure canning. And so I never use sage in any recipe that I'm going to be canning. Next up is salt and sugar. Now, in most recipes, salt and sugar are there for the flavor and not for the preservative characteristics that they also have. But we need to be sure that we make that distinction, because in almost all recipes you can vary the amount of salt and sugar. You can take sugar out, you can put sugar in, you can take salt out. I very seldom can with salt. Once in a while I do. We like to put salt on at the table instead of putting it in the canning jars. Now, fermenting recipes like sauerkraut, for instance, absolutely must have the called for amount of salt, because for fermenting, that is imperative for the fermenting process so that it doesn't spoil. So in that case, you don't mess with the amount of salt. But in terms of breads or cakes or anything that you're baking, but in canning, you can leave the salt out of recipes or whatever you'd like to do. Same with the sugar. Now, it's good to know that sugar is added to improve flavor. Well, most of us think that that would improve flavor, but there are some people that don't care for sugar and don't like that sweetness. It also added to stabilize the color, especially of fruits, and to retain the shape of the food, particularly fruits. Now, you can change the amount. I wouldn't go more, but you can certainly go less. But that's just me talking. And with sugar, it is very necessary in some recipes as part of a chemical reaction. And that would be the case when it is used with pectin, with boxed or liquid pectin. The required amount of sugar is, you just need to leave that in there. If you're wanting less sugar for jams and jellies, which is when we use pectin, then you can get some pectin that is low sugar pectin. Pomona's pectin doesn't depend on sugar. I have tried Pomona's pectin after being urged for a couple of years, and I discovered that I don't care for the taste or the flavor of Pomona's pectin, but many of you just love it. And so that gives you an option to decrease the amount of sugar. But if you're using regular pectin, like I do and will continue to do, keep the amount of sugar the same. So that's how we can adjust salt or sugar. All right, next up is acids. Acidification in today's canning world is absolutely necessary, and it has everything to do with botulism. It creates an environment where those botulism spores cannot turn vegetative and manufacture their toxin that is so lethal. And so we need to pay very particular attention of the acids that we use. And there are reasons why the USDA specifies what it does in terms of acidification. Now, the 4 main acids that are used in recipes are apple cider vinegar, distilled white vinegar, lime juice, and lemon juice. But the big question is, can we swap them around? If the recipe calls for lemon juice, couldn't I just use vinegar? Well, here is the answer to that question. We need to be very familiar with the pH scale. I have put the pH scale right here, and this may be a different representation of the pH scale than you have seen before. A lot of times I just lay it out horizontally. This time I've laid it out vertically. One of the things that I learned when I was in my doctoral program, Jim and I were actually, that's where we met, and we paired up pretty quickly after my first statistics class. And I learned that if I studied with someone else and if I looked at things that were represented the same concept represented in different ways, it really helped me gain that conceptual understanding of what it was that I was trying to figure out. So that is why I have put the pH scale as a ladder. And let's talk about that for just a minute. And I also have a video on that is now listed at the end of your handout that you can watch as well, where I lay it out horizontally. So pH scale is a measure of the degree of acid or base that a food is. So acids are down here at this end, bases are up here at this end. 7 is neutral. This is where water would be. If we were to do the pH of water, it would be about at a 7. Most foods are 7 or below, so this is where most of our foods are. We have very, very few foods that are up in the base range. Base goes from 8 to 14, with 14 being something like lye. And bleach is between 12 and 13. So those are things that we may be familiar with that are very strong bases. Battery acid would be a number 1. Lemon juice and vinegar are in this range right here. Now you notice that I have a pH of 4.6 in red out to the side here at where 4.6 would be. This is the important number in canning because any food that is, we call this range high acid because the stronger the acid, the lower the number. The stronger the base, the higher the number. And so that's what you need to keep in mind. From this point, acids get stronger as they go down. From this point, bases get stronger as they go up. And that is what can be confusing about trying to understand the pH scale. 4.6 as the dividing line between low acid and high acid foods, we know then that the high acid foods are at the bottom of the ladder. And the high acid foods include fruits, apples, pears, peaches, nectarines, grapes, almost all of the fruits are high acid. And we can water bath things that are down here because there is not danger of botulism toxin forming, because those little spores of the botulism organisms cannot reproduce or go vegetative in an acid environment. And so that's why water bath canning is here. Above 4.6 are where the meats and the vegetables are. Potatoes, carrots, celery, beets, all of the other things are right up here. These are the ones that need to be pressure canned to make sure that they are up to the high enough temperature for long enough processing time in order to kill those spores so they will not become vegetative. And then tomatoes are right now perched right there at that point. When I was growing up and canning tomatoes at home with my mother, we never had to acidify tomatoes. And it is because the tomatoes back then were all high acid, but they're no longer high acid, all of them. There are lots and lots of new varieties of tomatoes that have come on the scene over the past 30 years, and some of them are quite low acid. And so we cannot take the chance that whatever tomatoes we are working with are high acid. We always have to acidify tomatoes, even if we pressure can. By acidifying tomato products, we can water bath can at the regular processing times that were always there, or in some cases we can pressure can, but they still have to be acidified, and it allows us to reduce that processing time down to 10, 12, 15 minutes, depending on what the product is, instead of going the full 75 minutes or the full 90 minutes for pints or quarts. And so that is why we acidify tomatoes regardless of whether we're water bath canning or pressure canning. So back to the question, now that we know that acids are stronger as the number lowers, there is a little box on your handout that lists these 4 things and the pH of each one. And so here's the tricky part. Can we substitute one of these for the others? Mostly yes, but there's a huge caveat. The substituted one has to be at least as strong as or stronger than the one we are eliminating. And so let's look at our little box. Cider vinegar has the least amount of acid. Then white vinegar is stronger. Then lime juice is even stronger, and lemon juice is the strongest of all. So if a recipe calls for lemon juice, can we substitute? No, because there's nothing in this line that is the same acid strength as lemon juice is. What about doubling the acid? Right here I'm going to tell you it is really important when we think about tweaking as tested recipes, we don't do any fancy math. We don't figure out that, well, if it's this and if I double it, then that would, no fancy math. If it doesn't substitute straight across with equal strength, we can't do it. If it calls for cider vinegar, we can substitute any of these. If it calls for white vinegar, we can substitute these. If it calls for lime juice, we could use lemon juice instead. But if it calls for lemon juice, we're out of luck with substitutions. And that's just the way it is, and it has very much to do with pH. Acidification is critically important, so we need to be sure that we understand that. One other thing, too, is that I so much prefer the taste of fresh lemon juice to bottled lemon juice. That is something I've had to give up, because fresh lemon juice is not always the same pH from lemon to lemon to lemon. bottled lemon juice is standardized. And so we have to use something that has that standardized pH. So with acids, the thing to remember, two things. To substitute, it must be stronger than what is called for in the recipe, and the amount that you add has to be the same. Otherwise, it disrupts what the pH is, the volume, and the viscosity of the whatever the food is that we're doing. So that's just the way it is, and I live with it. Sweet peppers, fresh peppers are used in many, many canning recipes. And so there's good news here. And that news is that these peppers are interchangeable. Sweet, as long as they're fresh, sweet peppers, hot peppers can be used interchangeably with each other, except that the same amount has to be used. If it calls for a yellow pepper, if it calls for half a cup of diced yellow pepper, then if I'm not going to use the yellow pepper and I'm going to use this hot pepper instead, then it has to be a half a cup of diced hot pepper as well. So the amount has to be the same, but the peppers are interchangeable. So that is good news. One of the things that is really critically important is that sweet peppers, they fall in the low acid category. Remember, the strength decreases as we go up, and once we cross 4.6, then this is the low acid area right here. Because they are low acid and botulism comes into play here, we have to be very, very careful that we stay true to the amount that is called for in the recipe, because that has been determined by the testing of that tested recipe. So just use the same amount, but you can use any pepper that you wish. All right, next up is onions, and onions are ubiquitous in canning recipes. They're just almost in every single recipe that is a savory recipe. And so these are globe onions. I have a red one, I have a yellow one, and I have a white onion. And these can be used interchangeably. But what is not mentioned by any of the experts is whether or not these can be substituted for things like shallots or for green onions. So don't involve those in your swapping out, but you can change the type of onion, globe onion, that you use in the recipe. I've had several questions over the past few years about jar sizes. Well, the recipe says it can only be canned in pints. Can I just double everything and put it in quarts? Well, the answer to that is absolutely not. You cannot do that. That's that fancy math, that tricky math I was talking about. We can't double or cut in half processing times if we use a jar that is a different size than what is called for. We just have to use really good sense. Now, these are the acceptable sizes for canning. There are only two tested recipes for 2-quart jars, and that is apple juice and grape juice. Everything else, the hundreds of other recipes, have to be canned in quarts or pints or 8-ounce or 4-ounce jars. There are very few recipes for this, although I'm going to be showing a recipe in a video upcoming very soon that uses these jars, and I'm so excited about that. But what about if it calls for a quart jar and doesn't mention pints? Can I use a pint? Yes, you can. It makes more sense if your family is smaller or you are just a single person, like many of our viewers. There's just one in their household. And even for Jim and me, for the two of us, pints are far more economical for some foods than our quarts. And the answer is yes, you can do that, but don't cut the processing time in half. If there is no processing time given, don't assume that because so many recipes say 75 minutes for pints, that's what you should do. Do not do that. If you use a smaller size than what is called for and no processing time is given, you must use the processing time for the larger version. This happens a lot when people have a pint recipe, but they only want to can half of it. Yes, you can use this jar, but use this processing time. So the other way around is, if it is given a recipe calls only for pints, can't I just double that and do quarts? No, you can't go up the ladder, you can only go down the ladder. You can use a smaller size jar, but you can't turn a recipe by that tricky math of doubling it and do this, and then just double the processing time. That is not safe. And so then in terms of whether regular mouth or wide mouth, that's entirely up to you. So just know what to do with jars in canning recipes. We have just completed part 1, where we have learned a whole lot of things about a whole lot of strategies and the parameters that are okay for us to do some tweaking with tested recipes. We're now going to look at what we might be able to do if we wanted to take a recipe out of an older book. And this is really important. And be prepared to ditch the recipe if it doesn't work. So the first thing that we're going to do is we have to look at the list of ingredients to see if all of those ingredients are still safe to use in today's tested recipes. Well, how would you do that? So in this book, here is a recipe for applesauce. 2.5 to 3.5 pounds of apples per quart. So I found an applesauce recipe in this ball book. And it also says apples peeled, cored, quartered, treated to prevent browning, and drained. Okay, so I can use apples, that's not a problem. The next is sugar, and yes, there is sugar here, 3 cups of sugar. No amount of sugar is given here, but 3 cups is given here. And then it says water. There's no water listed here, but 4 tablespoons of lemon juice is added here. All right, so that tells me acidification, ensuring acidification of those apples. And so I would reject this applesauce recipe and I would go with this applesauce recipe, knowing that it is updated and everything is safe. Now you can do that with all ingredients, even in a more complex recipe that has more than 3 listed ingredients. You check ingredient by ingredient, and if you cannot find an exact match of a recipe to compare, get as close as you can. When I was doing the meat sauce, when I was testing canners, I looked up meat sauce recipes in every one of these tested recipe books, and I was able to see what ingredients I could tweak a little bit because they were included in one or another of those recipes. So matching ingredients is the first thing, and that's really important. Then if the ingredients match, you check the proportions to see how the proportions line up. Because in modern tested recipes, those proportions are critically important. And the fact here that it didn't give any sugar amount should be a cue to you to go ahead and follow here, because this says 3 cups of sugar, but we have learned in this section under what to do with salt and sugar that we could decrease that amount if we wanted to. Okay, then the third thing we would want to do is to compare the process. In this book, there are some things that are water bath canned that should now not be water bath canned. And so that's the kind of thing that we would want to look for to be sure that in the newer version, we follow that process. And so we can kind of look and compare and then use our good judgment and the things that we have learned to make the right choice about whether or not we would can it. So continuing with part 2, apply. I have photocopied 2 recipes out of this book. And your assignment is to take a look at those recipes, and then off to the right, you need to tell what you would do about those, whether you would end up canning them or not. If you're going to can them, what changes you would make. So if you're feeling like at a loss for that, we're going to go into the computer and I'm going to show you how to shortcut to that. So let's head in there and I can show you what to do. So I'll meet you at the computer. So here on my computer, we're at a new Google page. And I don't know why it's so bright. That just started happening a couple of days ago, so I don't know where all that brightness came from. So I'm going to go up here to the menu bar. And this is how I search for whether or not a recipe is tested. I always type in USDA, and I just do it in lowercase, canning. So I do the USDA canning. Those two words are in everything that I search for. And now this recipe says chicken soup. So USDA canning chicken soup. So let's see what it brings up. Oh, okay. The first, I'm going to move this over so maybe you can see it just a little bit easier. Burning issue, canning homemade soups. That's National Center for Home Food Preservation. That is a valid reference. National Center for Home Food Conservation, how do I can vegetable soups? That would be a good link. Then here's some more. Canning the best homemade chicken soup. Ooh, that's an individual's idea of chicken soup. I don't want to go there. Here's another one, pressure canning chicken soup. Rose Red Homestead. Oh, well, that's me, and I follow tested recipes, but maybe you didn't know that. Here's another one, pressure canning chicken vegetable soup. I don't follow anyone's individual information. I go to the links that I know are good. And so just a couple more, creative canning chicken soup. Ohio State University. Ah, that's a good one. Food preservation canning soup. And then my favorite, healthy canning, USDA's Your Choice soup recipe. OSU Extension, there's a good one. Food safety and preservation canning soup. And down it goes. So I already have a good set here that I trust. So let's go to the very top one. Burning issue, canning homemade soups. So here is the USDA's information about how we can can our own soups. Well, it's not chicken soup. So some things must have changed from 1999 when that recipe first came out to right now. The USDA doesn't have soups by individual names. They say, can I can my favorite soup recipe at home? And then it gives what you must do. So let's go back and see, there was another one. How do I can vegetable soups? Well, we wanted chicken soup. Oh, okay. Vegetable, dried bean or pea, meat, poultry, seafood soups can be canned. These directions are intended for use with ingredients that already have separate canning recommendation for those foods. So now you are getting some good information on this particular recipe that I photocopied. And it even tells you it can be hot packed in pints or quarts and processed for 60 minutes for pints and 75 minutes for quarts. Except if you use seafood, then it has to be for 100 minutes. I have all the information I need to write out here what it is that I would do with this soup. So let's go back in the kitchen. You might now want to pause the video and take just a few minutes and write out what you're going to beside chicken soup, and then do your own research on corned beef. What can you find on the safety of canning corned beef from USDA trusted sources? And then continuing on to part 3 is your learning check. So there are 4 questions there. It's like a little test, and you can test your own learning. And so do that. And then we will come back and go through everything. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed writing out what you would do with the chicken soup and the corned beef, and that you have your learning check done. So let's kind of go over what the correct responses or the wisest, safest choices would be. For canning chicken soup, this calls for chicken stock, diced celery, carrots, onions. So all of those ingredients we know are safe to use. So if you read through the canning your own soup information, what you could probably do is you can forego the recipe that was in the older book, and you can put whatever amounts you wish of the ingredients in the soup. You know that you need to boil it for a certain period of time, and then put it into the jars, and the ratio of the solids is half of the jar to a full jar of the broth. And so at least half of your jar needs to be filled with solids and then filled up to the top with broth. And fill up to the top, of course, leaving the appropriate head space as noted in the directions. Then you process it for either 60 or 75 minutes, depending on pints or quarts, and you're done. So that one was fairly easy. And we would end up with a soup that is very, very similar to the one that we might have really liked that was in that older book. Then for the corned beef, what did you find out? Yes, there are people who still can corned beef, but from the USDA perspective, absolutely not. Because the USDA now says no cured or smoked or brined or corned meat should be canned. And the reason for that is because those processes change the density of the meat, and the adequate testing has not yet been done on those to ensure the safety in canning. But I was quite taken by that corned beef recipe, and I think that I would make the corned beef, I just wouldn't can it. So that would be my choice on this one. So to be safe, do not can, but you could make it and eat it right after it was made. Not sure I would want to start with 25 pounds though, that's a little much for us, so I would have to cut that recipe down. Okay, now for your learning check. I always like to do these when I have the opportunity because you get to circle yes or no, but then you have to explain your answer, and that's where the learning comes in. So, number one, the USDA has a tested recipe for bottling apple juice, and I want to add some fresh ginger for taste and health. Is it safe? The key word there is adding what? Fresh ginger. And our parameter for adding flavorings is that it has to be dried. So this is a no, it would not be safe because the ginger is fresh. Number two, the tested recipe calls for 1 tablespoon cider vinegar for acidification. I plan to substitute 1 teaspoon of lemon juice. Is it safe? If we recall, the parameter for adjusting acids is we can substitute provided 2 things. One is that the one that we end up using in the recipe is at least the same same level of acidity or stronger. So we start with vinegar, but we're going to replace that with lemon juice. Oh yeah, that's okay. The second thing is that the amounts have to be the same. And so vinegar was a tablespoon, but the substitution was only a teaspoon, so that is not safe. Okay, 3. I'm following the USDA tested recipe for canning pinto beans, and I plan to add 1 strip of bacon to each jar. Is it safe? Well, we learned a little bit about that when we were looking into corned beef, and that is that the USDA does not recommend the canning of any cured meat whatsoever, like bacon or ham or salt pork. There are a couple of exceptions, but only if the tested recipe calls for it. One is Boston baked beans. It calls for a little tiny chunk of salt pork, as does, I think it is split pea soup. You can use just a little bit. But the original recipes of split soup call for like a huge amount of that salt pork or bacon in those recipes. So it's always good to check the newest version of the recipes to be sure that we're following instructions. I found an old recipe, this is number 4, that I love, and it matches a current tested recipe, except that it calls for 2 tablespoons of salt. I want to reduce the salt to a half a teaspoon. Is it safe? Yes, it is, because we have total control over the amount of salt that goes into our canning recipes. So that's a little application of the things that we have learned. And we've done our little learning check. So let's go to the very back page. So the review part is for you to do on your own. You can just read through those bullet points, and it is just a reminder of the things that we have done during our learn and apply and during our learning check. A lot of times during a learning check, we are able to clear up our own misconceptions about things and learn to read very, very carefully and to think clearly when we report our answers on that. So the bottom line is we can do small tweaks to some recipes, but we want to ensure the safety of our family, and so we need to be sure that we don't get so anxious to use either our own homemade recipes or someone else's that really do not have a tested recipe equivalent in the published information or online at the various extension offices where they might be available. So thank you so much for being with us in class today. I really enjoyed this. I hope you learned some important things that will help you be a very safe canning person. So we will see you soon for regular videos and in about a month for another class.